For 11 years, a wooden door inside an old American church had never been opened. No sign warned what lay behind it. No official order admitted why it was sealed. But everyone who served there knew the truth. Behind that door stood a statue of the Virgin Mary, removed from public sight and quietly locked away in the name of security. On this night, the city did not sleep. Helicopter blades cut the sky above government buildings. Sirens echoed through empty streets. Phones vibrated with half-formed rumors, federal units moving. A powerful man about to fall. Fear and anticipation spread through apartments, police cruisers, newsrooms, and prayer circles at the same time. Inside the church, a priest stood alone in the dim light, listening to the distant thunder of rotors overhead. Somewhere across the city, officers prepared handcuffs. Somewhere else, families gathered their children into living rooms, whispering prayers learned from grandparents. No one knew these moments were connected. No one imagined that politics and faith were about to collide in the same hour. When the priest reached the storage room, his hand paused on the old metal handle. That door had remained closed through elections, protests, scandals, and years of national division. It had stayed shut while trust in institutions collapsed and tempers hardened across the country. It had stayed shut while the Virgin Mary vanished from the streets but appeared instead in kitchens, on shelves, and beside hospital beds. As the lock finally turned, the city outside braced for arrest, headlines, and history. Inside that silent room, something else waited, something hidden for 11 years. Ready to return at the exact moment power would be stripped from one man and a nation would be forced to choose how it would respond. In the United States, devotion to the Virgin Mary had never belonged to a single group or a single generation. It lived quietly across neighborhoods that rarely appeared on postcards or campaign maps. In small brick churches tucked between apartment blocks. In suburban parishes where grandparents brought grandchildren on Sunday mornings. In immigrant homes where English was learned alongside the Hail Mary. For some, Mary was not a symbol of politics or power, but of survival. She was the one a single mother whispered to while counting the last bills in her wallet. The one an unemployed father turned toward when pride no longer covered fear. The one remembered by nurses lighting a candle before a night shift. By veterans sitting alone with memories they could not explain. By families divided by ideology but still united by prayer. There had once been a statue known simply as Our Lady of Hope. She stood tall and calm, hands joined, eyes lowered in compassion. Every year, she was carried through the streets, past diners, corner stores, office buildings, while people sang softly and strangers crossed themselves without knowing why. Those processions were not loud protests or declarations. They were reminders that beneath arguments and headlines, there was something older holding the country together. When those processions disappeared, many noticed the absence more than they expected. Streets felt the same, traffic flowed, businesses opened, yet something intangible had been removed. Like a heartbeat no one realized they depended on until it slowed. For older parishioners, it felt like losing a familiar rhythm of life. For younger ones, it became a story they heard but never experienced, a tradition spoken of in the past tense. Still, the devotion did not vanish. It adapted. In cramped apartments and quiet suburbs, Mary moved closer. She appeared on refrigerator doors, in framed prints above couches, in small statues bought years earlier and never thrown away. Kitchen tables became places of whispered prayer. Living rooms became sanctuaries. The faith that once walked openly through city streets now breathed behind closed doors. Across the nation, the social atmosphere grew heavier. Conversations hardened. Trust thinned. People argued about leaders, laws, and futures that felt increasingly uncertain. But in these same homes, another language continued uninterrupted. Pray for us. Stay with us. Do not abandon us. It was spoken without microphones, without cameras, without slogans. Parish priests noticed the change. Fewer grand celebrations, fewer public displays. Yet those who came differently. They did not come out of habit. They came carrying fear, exhaustion, and hope stripped of decoration. Confession lines grew longer. Prayer lingered after Mass ended. Candles burned longer than usual, as if no one wanted to leave the quiet presence behind. In this way, devotion to the Virgin Mary became something uniquely American in its resilience. Not imposed, not enforced, not advertised. It existed because millions chose it in private. Again and again, when public confidence faltered, it was not the faith of stadiums or rallies, but of kitchens, hospital rooms, and sleepless nights. And while many assumed that removing a statue from public view would slowly erase its influence, the opposite was happening. The heart of faith was not shrinking. It was concentrating, gathering strength in silence, waiting. There was never a single announcement. No headline declared that the Virgin Mary was forbidden. No press conference explained a ban. What happened instead unfolded the way modern power prefers, slowly, politely, and wrapped in reasonable language. It began with adjustments. Processions were shortened for safety. Routes were changed to avoid congestion. Outdoor statues were temporarily removed to prevent vandalism. Most people accepted these explanations at first. They sounded responsible, sensible, necessary in tense times. Then came the next step. Parish councils received suggestions, never orders. Perhaps it would be better to keep the statue inside this year. Perhaps large public gatherings could be misunderstood. Perhaps faith should remain private, away from cameras and crowds. The word perhaps did most of the work. No one wanted to be labeled reckless or provocative. In one church, volunteers arrived early one morning and quietly lifted the statue from the courtyard. A maintenance worker watched as the pedestal was left empty. By Sunday, people noticed the gap. Some asked questions. Others assumed it was temporary. Life moved on. In another parish, a priest was advised that displaying the image near the main entrance might create unnecessary attention. He nodded, uneasy but compliant. The statue was moved to a side chapel. Fewer people passed by it. Fewer candles were lit. Over time, what had once been central drifted toward the margins. Not because the faithful had rejected it, but because the space around it had been carefully narrowed. One hallway shorter, one door closed, one light switched off. Officials never spoke of faith directly. They spoke of order, stability, neutrality. In their language, the Virgin Mary was not an object of devotion, but a variable to be managed. Something that might stir emotions in an already divided nation. Something best kept quiet. Older parishioners felt the change most sharply. Women who had once carried flowers in processions now walked past empty spaces where the statue used to stand. Men who had grown up kneeling on sidewalks during feast days noticed that the calendar felt thinner. Stripped of color, they voiced concerns. Gently at first. They were met with soft answers. These are sensitive times. We don't want to escalate tensions. It's better this way. For now stretched in 2 years. Meanwhile, younger generations barely noticed what was being lost. They had never known the streets filled with hymns. For them, Mary had always belonged indoors. Framed in quiet, the disappearance did not shock them. It simply became normal. And so, without force or confrontation, something profound was pushed out of sight. Not erased, but confined. Not attacked, but suffocated. The statue was eventually moved again, into a storage room. Behind a solid door, locked and rarely opened. From the outside, nothing dramatic had happened. Churches still stood. Masses were still celebrated. Prayers were still said. But anyone paying close attention could sense the difference. A presence once carried openly through the city now existed only in whispers and memory. Power had achieved what it wanted without ever naming it. The Virgin Mary had not been banned. She had been buried, alive, waiting in silence, while the nation learned what happens when symbols are removed not by force, but by forgetting. When the streets grew quiet, the faith did not disappear. It simply changed addresses. Without processions to follow and statues to gather around, devotion slipped indoors, unnoticed by cameras and authorities alike. It crossed thresholds and settled into the most ordinary rooms of American life. Kitchens, living rooms, bedrooms where the light stayed on long after midnight. In a small apartment above a laundromat, a grandmother cleared a corner of her kitchen counter. She taped a printed image of the Virgin Mary to the wall. Just above the coffee maker, a candle in a glass jar stood beside it, lit every evening after dinner. She did not announce what she was doing. She simply did it, the way she had always done important things. Across town, a single mother placed a tiny statue on the shelf above her television. She prayed while her children slept on the couch, exhausted from another day of school and uncertainty. Her words were simple: help me get through tomorrow. Help me not lose patience. Help me keep them safe. In houses where faith had once been expressed publicly, it now learned to whisper. The rosary was prayed softly, often late at night, when the noise of the day finally faded. Kitchen tables became altars, chairs became pews, the clatter of dishes mixed with Hail Marys spoken under breath. Children grew up watching this quiet devotion without fully understanding it. They heard stories instead of seeing spectacles. Stories of streets filled with flowers, of hymns echoing between buildings, of a statue carried on strong shoulders while people cried and sang at the same time. For them, these stories sounded almost unreal, like something from another country or another century. Yet those same children learned faith in a different way. They learned it by watching adults kneel on cold floors, by seeing candles relit night after night, even when hope seemed thin, by noticing how arguments softened when prayer began. They learned that faith was not something performed, but something endured. In these homes, Mary became closer than she had ever been during public celebrations. She was no longer distant, elevated above crowds. She was present during homework, during unpaid bills spread across the table, during phone calls that carried bad news. She stood quietly beside hospital beds and unemployment letters. She listened as people spoke words they could not say out loud anywhere else. Parish priests noticed the shift when people came to church. Attendance numbers fluctuated, but the intensity changed. Those who came stayed longer. They prayed as if something depended on it. Because it did. Faith was no longer a cultural habit. It was a lifeline. Outside, the city continued to argue with itself. Headlines shouted. Opinions hardened. But behind closed doors, a different rhythm formed. A hidden network of prayer moved from home to home, connecting families who never met, neighborhoods that never spoke, generations that rarely understood each other. What power had pushed out of public space had become impossible to remove from private life. The Virgin Mary, no longer carried through streets, now walked through kitchens and hallways. She entered lives without permission, invited by exhaustion, fear, and stubborn hope. And while officials assumed that removing visible symbols would weaken belief, something unexpected was happening. Faith was being refined, stripped of banners and crowds. It grew quieter, denser, and harder to extinguish. In the absence of spectacle, devotion learned to survive on its own. It learned to wait. As faith retreated into kitchens and living rooms, the world outside those doors grew louder and harsher. The country felt strained, like a structure carrying more weight than it was built to hold. Trust, once assumed, rarely questioned, began to fracture in visible ways. News cycles moved faster than understanding. One scandal replaced another. Institutions that had once projected confidence now spoke in careful, defensive language. Courtrooms, legislatures, and agencies became battlegrounds of accusation and counter-accusation. For ordinary people, the details blurred together. What remained was a growing sense that no one was really in control. In one neighborhood, a small business owner stared at a notice taped to his door, calculating how many more months he could survive. In another, a nurse worked double shifts while wondering whether the system she served would still protect her family. A police officer drove home after midnight, uncertain whether he was still seen as a guardian or an enemy. Each carried a quiet question: who can be trusted now? Conversations changed tone. At family dinners, politics replaced weather as the source of tension. Old friendships cooled over opinions shaped by different screens and algorithms. People spoke past one another, repeating phrases borrowed from commentators they had never met. Even churches felt the strain. Parishioners sat in the same pews but avoided the same topics, afraid that one wrong word could break something fragile. The social contract, unwritten but deeply felt, seemed to be thinning. Rules still existed, but confidence in fairness eroded. Promises sounded rehearsed. Apologies felt strategic. Many stopped expecting solutions and settled instead for endurance. For some, anger became a shield. For others, Cynicism replaced hope. Young adults questioned whether the future would offer stability at all. Older generations watched with a mix of fear and disbelief, recognizing patterns they had hoped never to see again. In this climate, public symbols mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. When statues disappeared and processions ended, it felt like more than a religious adjustment. It felt like another signal that shared reference points were vanishing. Another thread cut from a fabric already fraying. Yet beneath the noise, something quieter was happening. In homes where faith had moved indoors, prayer grew more urgent, not poetic, not symbolic, urgent in the way of people who feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. They prayed not for victory, but for stability, not for triumph, but for the strength to endure whatever came next. Parish priests heard it in confessionals and counseling rooms. People spoke less about doctrine and more about fear. Fear of losing jobs, fear of losing loved ones, fear of losing the country they thought they understood. Many admitted they no longer trusted leaders, systems, or even neighbors, but they still trusted one thing, that they were not alone. Outside, rallies formed and dissolved. Arguments flared online and vanished into new distractions. Inside homes, candles continued to burn. The contrast grew sharper by the day. A society arguing loudly about power, and a people quietly searching for meaning. As confidence in institutions weakened, the stakes rose. The question was no longer which side would win an argument, but what would remain when trust was gone. In that uncertainty, faith, stripped of spectacle and forced into silence, began to take on a different weight. It was no longer a background tradition. It was becoming an anchor. And anchors, once set, do not move easily. At the center of it all was a man most people barely noticed. Father Gabriel Hayes did not appear on television. He was never quoted in opinion columns or invited onto panels. His name rarely traveled beyond the parish bulletin pinned crookedly near the church entrance. To the city, he was just another aging priest serving an old neighborhood church that most commuters passed without a second glance. Yet inside that building, he carried something no one else did. He held the key. For more than a decade, Father Gabriel had been entrusted with the quiet responsibility of guarding a locked storage room behind the sacristy. It was not a role he had sought. It had been handed to him with a few careful words, a lowered voice, and a look that suggested both caution and burden. The statue, he was told, should remain out of sight, not destroyed, not removed from the church, simply not visible. At first, he obeyed without protest. Prudence, after all, was part of his vocation. He understood the language of caution. He understood fear, but obedience did not erase memory. He remembered the statue as it once was, standing at the center of the sanctuary, surrounded by candles and flowers. He remembered the sound of hymns echoing off stone walls. He remembered people lining up just to touch the base, to leave folded notes tucked into flowers, to cry without explanation. That memory stayed with him, even as the door stayed closed. Years passed, congregations shrank, faces changed. Some parishioners aged visibly, others vanished entirely, leaving behind empty pews and unanswered questions. Through it all, Father Gabriel returned again and again to the same small room. He never went there casually. Sometimes it was late at night, after locking the church doors and turning off the lights. Sometimes it was early morning, before the city fully woke. He would unlock the door, step inside, and stand in silence before the covered figure. He rarely uncovered the statue completely. It felt too intimate, too exposed. Instead, he would rest his hand on the cloth and speak softly. He spoke for people who had no words left. A mother whose son had stopped coming home. A man drowning in debt and shame. A teenager whose anger frightened even himself. An elderly woman who had lost everyone and didn't understand why she was still here. Father Gabriel did not ask for miracles. He asked for endurance, for mercy, for a way through the confusion that sermons and slogans could not untangle. To outsiders, his parish seemed quiet, even fading, but those who came regularly noticed something different. They noticed how he listened longer than necessary, how he never rushed prayers, how he spoke less about answers and more about staying present. He did not promise solutions. He offered accompaniment. In a world where authority often shouted, he whispered. In a time when leaders demanded loyalty, he modeled patience. Some wondered if he was too gentle. Others sensed that his gentleness concealed a kind of strength that could not be measured in words. He carried the tension of two responsibilities: loyalty to instructions given long ago, loyalty to the people who still knelt in his pews. Between them stood a locked door, silent and heavy. Father Gabriel never spoke publicly about what lay behind it. He never hinted at rebellion. But night after night, as the city outside grew louder and more divided, he found himself returning to the same quiet conviction. Some things are not meant to disappear forever. Some things are meant to wait. And he, whether he fully understood it or not, had become the keeper of that waiting. The first stories arrived quietly, the way rumors always do when no one wants to sound foolish. A woman mentioned it after evening mass, her voice low, eyes searching the floor. She said the air near the side chapel had smelled like roses, fresh, unmistakable, though there were no flowers anywhere in the church. Another parishioner laughed it off, suggesting perfume. The conversation ended there, polite and unresolved. A week later, someone else spoke up. This time it was an older man who had attended daily mass for years without ever making a fuss. He said he thought he saw moisture on the face of a small statue of the Virgin Mary during early morning prayer. Just a trace, barely visible. He assumed it was condensation and wiped it away. But the image lingered in his mind. Father Gabriel listened to these accounts without reacting. He had heard such things before. Long ago, in other places. He knew how easily suffering sharpened perception. How hope could blur into imagination. He reminded himself of his training. Faith is built on the gospel, not on signs. Still, he paid attention. One night, after locking the doors, he walked alone into the side chapel. He stood beneath the dim lights and breathed in deeply. The air smelled like old wood and wax. Nothing more. He examined the statue carefully. The surface was dry. The ceiling showed no leaks. Everything appeared ordinary. For several days, nothing happened. Then, during a quiet weekday mass attended by fewer than a dozen people, a woman in the back row noticed it again. A faint line, almost like a tear, tracing down from the statue's eye. She said nothing at first. She stayed until the church emptied, unsure of herself. When she finally approached the priest, her words came out hesitant and apologetic. "I don't know how to explain this, Father," she said, "but something feels different." Similar conversations began surfacing in other parishes across the city. Never dramatic, never public, always in whispers. Someone spoke of a sudden peace that settled during the rosary, heavier than usual, almost physical. Someone else mentioned the scent of flowers returning during prayer, then vanishing without explanation. Father Gabriel noticed the pattern. These stories did not appear during emotional gatherings or public events. They emerged in quiet moments, weekday masses, late-night rosaries, half-empty churches where no one was trying to impress anyone else. He contacted his bishop, choosing his words carefully. The response was measured and calm. "Be prudent, observe, do not encourage speculation. If something is happening, it must lead to deeper humility, not excitement." So Father Gabriel said nothing from the pulpit. He did not announce signs or wonders. Instead, he spoke more often about patience, about remaining faithful when nothing visible seems to change, about trusting God in silence. And yet, beneath that silence, something subtle was shifting. Those who experienced these small moments did not feel triumphant or vindicated. They felt steadied, as if someone had placed a hand on their shoulder in the dark. The signs did not erase fear or fix broken systems. They did not provide answers to political chaos or personal loss. They did something quieter. They reminded people that they were seen. As the city outside continued to argue and fracture, these whispers moved through parishes like a low current. Not enough to make headlines. Not enough to convince skeptics. But enough to prepare hearts for something no one yet understood. Something was approaching. And the signs, small and easily dismissed, were only the beginning. By then, two stories were unfolding at the same time, moving toward each other without ever touching. In one current, the language was sharp and technical. Officers with frosted glass lights stayed on late into the night. Screens filled with charts, timelines, and legal language. Names were underlined. Phone calls were made in careful tones. Investigations advanced step by step, measured and methodical. The public heard only fragments, leaks, denials, carefully worded statements that hinted at something larger forming beneath the surface. Commentators debated strategy and consequences. Some spoke confidently about accountability. Others warned of instability. The faces on television appeared certain, but the pauses between their words suggested otherwise. Power was shifting, but no one could yet say how far or how fast. In the other current, there were no microphones and no briefings. There were kitchens lit by a single bulb, living rooms where the television stayed off. Small groups gathered after long workdays, sitting close, speaking softly. Rosaries passed from hand to hand. Names were spoken aloud: children, parents, neighbors, leaders, even enemies. No one analyzed outcomes. They asked only for protection, wisdom, and peace. Parish calendars quietly changed. Extra hours were added for prayer. Confessionals stayed open later than usual. Notices appeared on bulletin boards inviting people to fast, to pray, to come if they felt restless or afraid. Attendance fluctuated, but the intensity did not. Those who came stayed longer, as if reluctant to step back into the noise outside. Some sensed the tension physically, a heaviness in the air, a feeling that decisions were being made far away that would soon touch ordinary lives. In workplaces and schools, conversations stopped mid-sentence when news alerts buzzed. In churches, silence deepened instead of breaking. A lawyer working downtown scanned headlines on her phone between meetings. Her jaw tight. That night, she knelt beside her mother at the kitchen table, unsure which words to say first. A college student argued politics online during the day, then slipped into the back pew of a nearly empty church after sunset. Staying longer than planned, a retired veteran watched press conferences with narrowed eyes, then reached for a rosary he hadn't used in years. No one coordinated these responses. There was no central call. And yet, the movement felt organized in a way no institution could explain. Father Gabriel sensed it too. He felt it in the way people spoke to him after Mass, not demanding answers, not seeking predictions, but asking how to stay steady, how to remain human if everything broke loose. He listened more than he spoke. Outside, the machinery of power continued to turn. Meetings concluded, decisions hardened, plans moved from discussion to preparation. The tone of official statements shifted subtly, as if bracing for impact. Inside homes and churches, prayer grew simpler, less language, more silence, less asking for change, more asking for strength. These two currents never acknowledged each other. One moved through press rooms and secure lines. The other moved through whispers and candles. One trusted leverage and law. The other trusted patience and mercy. Both were accelerating. And somewhere between them stood a locked door behind a sacristy, silent. Waiting, unaware of the exact moment. Yet perfectly positioned for when these parallel stories would finally collide. When they did, the collision would not happen in a speech or a courtroom. It would happen in a single night. The city was awakened before dawn by a sound no one could mistake. Helicopters tore through the darkness, low and relentless, their rotors beating the air like a warning. Sirens followed, rising and falling through empty streets. Windows glowed on and off across apartment buildings as phones lit up with urgent alerts and half-formed messages. Something was happening. Everyone felt it, even before they understood it. In one high-rise, a young couple stood on their balcony, scanning the sky as searchlights swept across rooftops. In a row house a few blocks away, a mother pulled her children from their beds and gathered them into the hallway, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken out loud in years. Somewhere downtown, officers moved with practiced speed, their radios clipped tight, their faces set on a single objective. Above the city, power announced itself loudly. Inside an old neighborhood church, it was quiet. Father Gabriel had not gone home that night. Restlessness had kept him pacing the empty nave long after the last candle should have been extinguished. When the first thrum of helicopters rolled through the stone walls, The floor seemed to tremble beneath his feet. His instincts told him to seek shelter. Instead, he turned toward the sacristy. The locked door stood exactly where it always had. His hands shook as he fit the key into the lock. Outside, the noise intensified, engines shouted commands, the sharp edge of urgency. Inside, the door opened with a soft, almost fragile sound, as if it had been waiting. The storage room was dim, lit by a single weak bulb. The statue stood wrapped in cloth, silent and familiar. Father Gabriel reached forward and pulled the covering back from the face. The light changed. Not suddenly, not violently. It was subtle, like the first hint of dawn before sunrise. The carved features of the Virgin Mary appeared gently illuminated, not by the bulb above, but from within, as if the wood itself were holding a quiet glow. Her hands, joined in prayer, reflected the same soft radiance. Father Gabriel froze. He turned the light switch off. The room darkened, but the glow remained. Not bright enough to blind, just enough to be undeniable. He dropped to his knees as the distant thunder of helicopters continued overhead. In other parts of the city, similar moments unfolded. In a small chapel across town, a handful of people who had gathered out of fear noticed their Marianne statue seemed brighter than usual, outlined by a pale halo that did not flicker with the emergency lights. In another parish, the scent of roses filled the air during a whispered rosary, strong and unmistakable, though no flowers were anywhere in sight. These moments were not planned. They were not announced. They happened as people did the only thing they knew how to do when the ground felt unsteady: they prayed. Outside, the night reached its climax. Convoys moved. Doors were breached. A powerful man was taken into custody under the cover of darkness. His fate sealed not by votes or speeches, but by a coordinated strike executed with precision. Cameras would capture the aftermath later. The handcuffs, the guarded transfer, the images that would flood screens by morning. But in that hour, few saw it. What they felt instead was contrast. The violence of engines in the sky, the calm inside sanctuaries, the weight of fear outside walls, the strange peace settling within them. Some would later say the fear didn't vanish, but it no longer ruled. Back in the storage room, Father Gabriel remained kneeling, unable to explain what he was seeing, yet certain of one thing. The silence in that room was not empty. It was full, as if the long years of waiting had reached their end. By the time the helicopters began to fade and the sky lightened toward gray, two truths had already been written into the night. Power had moved with force, and faith had answered without noise. When morning came, the city would wake to headlines and shock. But those who had been in the churches that night would remember something else entirely. They would remember the light. Morning arrived quietly, almost cautiously, as if the city itself was unsure how to breathe after what had happened. News alerts confirmed what rumors had shouted through the night: the powerful man who once seemed untouchable was gone. Handcuffed, escorted, removed from the center of the story he had dominated for years. Reactions fractured immediately. Some felt relief, others fear. Some spoke of justice, others of instability. Screens filled with analysis, speculation, and predictions. Power had shifted, and everyone wanted to explain it. But inside the churches, a different response was unfolding. Before dawn fully broke, doors opened. People came without coordination, without slogans, without instructions. Some arrived still shaken, others curious, others simply drawn by an instinct they could not name. They stepped inside and stopped. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood in full view for the first time in 11 years. Older parishioners recognized her instantly. Their hands trembled as they crossed themselves. Younger faces stared longer, seeing with their own eyes what had lived only in stories. No one rushed. No one spoke loudly. Knees bent. Candles were lit. Silence did the rest. Outside, power had fallen in a single night. Inside, something older and steadier had returned. The priest did not speak about arrests or politics. He spoke about humility, about history's long memory, about how human authority rises loudly and falls suddenly, while faith survives quietly, waiting for the moment it is needed most. He reminded them that Mary had never been a weapon or a banner. She was a mother, one who stands beside her children when certainty collapses and fear takes over. Across the city, similar scenes appeared. Long lines outside churches, families kneeling together after years of arguing, strangers sharing silence instead of accusations. There was no celebration of revenge, no victory chants, only prayer for peace, for mercy, for the future, even for the fallen. That was what shocked those watching from afar. Not the fall of power. History had seen that before. But the response. A people choosing not to shout, but to kneel. Choosing not to replace one idol with another, but to return to a compass they trusted when everything else failed. The message was unmistakable. Power can dominate headlines. Faith shapes hearts. And when the noise fades, it is the quiet choices of ordinary people that decide what comes next. If this story moved you, if you believe light still appears in the darkest hours, subscribe to Mary's Light in the Darkness. Stay with us as we continue sharing stories of faith, hope, and quiet courage when the world needs them most.